MGM Studios, Soundstage 12, March 15, 1954. The cast and crew of Greenfire were filming a romantic scene when Grace Kelly suddenly stopped mid-sentence, walked across the set and slapped her co-star Stewart Granger so hard that the sound echoed throughout the entire soundstage. 50 crew members watched in stunned silence as Hollywood's most elegant actress stood over the fallen actor, her face twisted with a rage that no one had ever seen before. "You selfish, arrogant bastard," Grace said in a voice that was barely controlled. "How dare you?" Stewart Granger touched his reddening cheek, too shocked to respond. The cameras had stopped rolling, but no one moved. No one spoke. No one had ever seen Grace Kelly lose control like this. What had happened in that moment was the culmination of weeks of jealousy, betrayal, and professional sabotage that had been building between Grace and her co-star. But the slap itself wasn't just about one moment of anger. It was about a conspiracy to destroy Grace Kelly's career that had been orchestrated by someone she trusted completely. The person Grace slapped wasn't just her co-star, it was someone who had been systematically sabotaging her performances, stealing her scenes and trying to get her fired from the biggest film of her career. And when Grace Kelly finally discovered the truth about what had been happening behind her back, her reaction shocked everyone who thought they knew Hollywood's most composed actress. To understand what drove Grace Kelly to violence, you need to understand the toxic environment that had been building on the Greenfire set for weeks before the infamous slap. Greenfire was supposed to be Grace Kelly's breakthrough into adventure films. After her success in romantic dramas, MGM wanted to prove that Grace could handle action sequences and outdoor adventure stories. The film was set in Colombia and featured Grace as an adventurous American woman who falls in love with an emerald prospector played by Stewart Granger. Stewart Granger was a British actor who had achieved significant success in Hollywood adventure films during the early 1950s. He was handsome, experienced, and had a reputation for being professional and reliable. But Granger also had a reputation for something else. He believed that male actors should always be the dominant stars of any film, and he had a history of undermining his female co-stars when he felt they were getting too much attention. Grace Kelly represented everything that Stewart Granger resented about the changing dynamics of 1950s Hollywood. Grace was not just beautiful, she was intelligent, well-educated, and came from a wealthy family. She didn't need acting for financial survival like many other actresses. She acted because she loved the craft and was exceptionally good at it. More importantly, Grace had the respect of directors, producers, and other actors because of her professionalism and talent. She was becoming the kind of actress who could demand equal billing and equal treatment with her male co-stars. Stewart Granger found this threatening. From the first day of filming Greenfire, Granger began a systematic campaign to undermine Grace's confidence and performance. The sabotage started small. During rehearsals, Granger would deliberately change his blocking, his movements, and positions without telling Grace. This forced Grace to adjust her own performance on the spot, making her look unprepared and unprofessional. When Grace tried to discuss the blocking changes with Granger, he would claim that he had informed her of the changes and suggest that she hadn't been paying attention. "Perhaps you need to focus more, darling," Granger would say with a condescending smile. "This is a complex scene." Grace initially assumed these were innocent mistakes, but as filming progressed, the pattern became impossible to ignore. Granger began arriving late to set, forcing Grace to wait around in full costume and makeup. When questioned by the director, Granger would claim that he had been reviewing his lines or preparing for difficult scenes. The delays cost the production time and money, and Grace began to worry that the studio would blame her for the inefficiencies. More seriously, Granger began upstaging Grace during their scenes together. Upstaging is an old theater term that refers to actors positioning themselves in ways that force their scene partners to turn away from the audience. In film, upstaging involves subtle movements and gestures that draw the camera's attention away from other actors. Granger was a master of this technique. During Grace's close-ups, he would make small hand gestures or facial expressions that pulled the camera operator's focus away from Grace and onto himself. During Grace's dialogue scenes, Granger would shift his position slightly so that Grace had to turn her back to the camera to maintain eye contact with him. These techniques were so subtle that the director, Andrew Martin, didn't initially notice what was happening, but Grace was experienced enough to recognize the manipulation. When Grace brought her concerns to director Martin, Granger denied any intentional upstaging. "I'm simply trying to find the most natural positions for the scenes," Granger told Martin. Perhaps Miss Kelly is feeling insecure about her performance and is looking for someone to blame. This comment infuriated Grace, but she maintained her professional composure. She had been taught that successful actresses never complained about their co-stars or created drama on set. But Granger was just getting started with his campaign of sabotage. During the third week of filming, Granger began making subtle changes to his dialogue that affected Grace's cue lines. Grace would be prepared to deliver her lines in response to specific cues from Granger. But during filming, Granger would change his delivery or word choice slightly, throwing off Grace's timing and making her responses sound awkward. When Grace asked Granger to stick to the script as written, he claimed that he was simply finding the natural rhythms of the character. "Real actors know how to adapt, darling," Granger told Grace. "You can't just memorize lines like a school play. You need to be flexible and responsive." Grace began staying up late every night preparing for multiple variations of each scene in case Granger changed his approach during filming. But the most damaging aspect of Granger's sabotage was his treatment of Grace in front of the crew. Granger began making subtle comments about Grace's inexperience with adventure films. He would suggest that Grace needed extra help with physical sequences, or that she might not be strong enough for certain stunts. "Don't worry, love," Granger would say loud enough for crew members to hear. "I know you're not used to this kind of demanding work. We'll take care of you." These comments were phrased as concern, but they undermined Grace's confidence and made the crew question her abilities. Granger also began telling stories about his previous films and co-stars, always emphasizing how much more experienced and professional they had been compared to some actors who relied on their looks rather than their talent. Grace understood that these comments were directed at her, but they were phrased so indirectly that she couldn't confront Granger without seeming paranoid or overly sensitive. The psychological pressure of Granger's campaign began to affect Grace's performance. Grace started second-guessing her instincts during scenes. She became tentative and careful, trying to anticipate how Granger might change his approach rather than trusting her own preparation. This tentative quality was exactly what Granger wanted. He knew that if Grace appeared uncertain or insecure on camera, the studio would question whether she was right for the role. By the fourth week of filming, rumors were spreading throughout MGM that Grace Kelly was having trouble with the demands of adventure filmmaking. Some crew members, influenced by Granger's subtle campaign, began to whisper that Grace was in over her head and might need to be replaced. Grace was aware of these rumors and felt increasingly isolated and frustrated. The breaking point came during a scene that was supposed to showcase Grace's character at her most confident and capable. Grace had prepared extensively for the scene, working with the dialogue coach and rehearsing her blocking until it was perfect. But when the cameras rolled, Granger began improvising dialogue that completely changed the dynamics of the scene. Instead of responding to Grace's character as an equal partner, Granger began treating her as a helpless damsel who needed to be rescued. "Don't worry about that, sweetheart," Granger ad-libbed. "Let me handle the dangerous thinking. You just look pretty and stay safe." These lines were not in the script. They transformed Grace's character from a strong, capable woman into a stereotypical weak female character. Grace tried to stay in character and continue the scene, but Granger kept improvising lines that undermined her character's strength and intelligence. When director Martin called cut, Grace immediately approached him about Granger's unauthorized script changes. "Andrew, those lines aren't in the script," Grace said. "Stewart is completely changing the character dynamics." But Granger had anticipated this objection. "I thought the improvisation felt very natural," Granger told Martin. "Sometimes spontaneous dialogue captures truths that written scripts miss. Don't you think the scene felt more authentic with those changes?" Martin, who wanted to avoid conflict between his stars, suggested that they try the scene both ways and decide in editing which version worked better. But Grace understood that this was exactly how Granger's sabotage worked. By framing his undermining as creative choices, Granger could destroy Grace's performance while appearing to be collaborative. Grace asked to speak with Granger privately. They walked to Grace's dressing room, away from the crew and cameras. "Stewart," Grace said, trying to remain calm, "I know what you're doing. You've been sabotaging my performance for weeks. The changed blocking, the improvised dialogue, the comments to the crew. It's all deliberate." Granger's mask of friendly professionalism finally slipped. "Darling," he said with a cold smile, "you're an amateur who got lucky with a few romantic parts. Adventure films require real actors, not pretty socialites who think they can play dress-up." Grace was stunned by the open hostility in his voice. "You don't belong in this business," Granger continued. You should go back to Philadelphia and find a nice husband. Leave the acting to people who actually have talent." Grace felt a rage building inside her that she had never experienced before. "You've been trying to get me fired," Grace said quietly. "You've been undermining me because you're threatened by working with an actress who's actually good at her job." Granger laughed. "Good at your job? You're a joke, Grace. Everyone on this set knows it. The only reason you have a career is because you look good in pretty dresses." "That's not true," Grace said, but she could feel her composure beginning to crack. "Oh, but it is true," Granger said, moving closer. "And after this film, when everyone sees how weak you are in action scenes, your little career will be over. No director will want to work with an actress who can't handle demanding roles." Grace realized that Granger had been deliberately sabotaging her performance not just to make himself look better, but to actually destroy her career entirely. "You're pathetic," Grace said, her voice shaking with anger. "You're so insecure that you have to tear down other actors to feel important." Granger's expression became truly cruel. "You think you're special because you went to fancy schools and come from money, but in this business you're nothing, and soon everyone will know it." Grace turned to leave, but Granger wasn't finished. "Run back to Daddy, little princess," Granger called after her. "This business is for grown-ups." Grace stopped at the door of her dressing room and turned back to face Granger. For the first time in her life, Grace Kelly felt murderous rage. Grace returned to the set in a controlled fury. She had never experienced the level of anger she felt towards Stewart Granger, but she was determined not to let him see how much he had affected her. The crew was setting up for the next scene. Ironically, a romantic moment between Grace and Granger's characters. Grace took her mark and waited for the cameras to roll, trying to channel her anger into her performance. But as soon as Granger began delivering his lines, Grace could see the smug satisfaction in his eyes. He thought he had broken her. He thought he had won. And then Granger made one final, devastating mistake. In the middle of the romantic scene, Granger decided to ad-lib one more line that he thought would be the final blow to Grace's confidence. "You know, darling," Granger said, breaking character and speaking directly to Grace rather than to her character, "some women just aren't strong enough for this kind of work." That line, delivered with Granger's characteristic cruel smile while 50 crew members watched, Grace stopped mid-scene, walked directly across the set, and slapped Stewart Granger across the face with all the force she could muster. The sound of the slap echoed throughout soundstage 12 like a gunshot. Granger staggered backward, his hand flying to his cheek, his eyes wide with shock. The entire crew stood frozen. No one had ever seen Grace Kelly lose control. No one had ever seen her show any emotion stronger than mild disappointment. But Grace wasn't finished. "You arrogant, pathetic bastard," Grace said in a voice that carried clearly across the silent soundstage. "How dare you think you can destroy my career because you're threatened by a woman who's better at this job than you are?" Grace stepped closer to Granger, who was still too shocked to respond. "I know exactly what you've been doing," Grace continued, her voice shaking with fury. "The sabotage, the upstaging, the psychological games, all because you can't stand working with an actress who doesn't need your approval or protection." By now, the entire crew had gathered around to witness the confrontation. Cameras had stopped rolling. Production had come to a complete halt. "You want to know the truth about who belongs in this business?" Grace said, her voice rising. "I've worked harder, prepared more thoroughly, and delivered better performances than you have in every single scene of this film. And you know it." Granger finally found his voice. "You're crazy," he said, touching his reddening cheek. "You're having some kind of breakdown." "No," Grace said firmly. "I'm finally showing you what happens when you push a strong woman too far." Grace turned to address the assembled crew. "For 4 weeks, I've endured Stewart Granger's unprofessional behavior because I thought maintaining set harmony was more important than defending myself. I was wrong." Grace looked back at Granger. "If you ever speak to me with disrespect again, if you ever try to sabotage my performance again, if you ever make another comment about my abilities or my place in this business, I will make sure that everyone in Hollywood knows exactly what kind of actor you really are." Then Grace turned and walked off the set, leaving Stewart Granger holding his face and 50 crew members staring in complete silence. The aftermath of Grace Kelly's on-set slap was immediate and dramatic. Director Andrew Martin called an emergency meeting with MGM executives to discuss what had happened and how to proceed with the film. Stewart Granger demanded that Grace be fired and replaced immediately. "She's clearly unstable," Granger told the executives. "I can't work with someone who becomes violent when she's criticized. She's a danger to the entire production." But Granger had made a crucial miscalculation. Several crew members who had witnessed weeks of Granger's subtle sabotage came forward to support Grace's version of events. Script supervisor Helen Morrison told executives that Granger had been making unauthorized dialogue changes that undermined Grace's character. Camera operator Frank Chen reported that Granger had been deliberately upstaging Grace during her close-ups. Assistant director Mike Wallace confirmed that Granger had been arriving late to set and causing delays that he allowed Grace to be blamed for. Most damaging to Granger's position, sound engineer Tom Bradley had been recording rehearsals and had captured audio of several of Granger's cruel comments to Grace, including the conversation in her dressing room that had immediately preceded the slap. When MGM executives heard Granger's recorded voice telling Grace that she didn't belong in the business and should go back to Philadelphia and find a nice husband, they understood that Grace's violent reaction had been provoked by weeks of professional harassment. The studio faced a difficult decision. Stewart Granger was an established star with a track record of successful films. Grace Kelly was a relative newcomer who had just committed an act of on-set violence. But MGM also understood that Grace was their most promising young actress, and that losing her could cost them millions of dollars in future revenue. More importantly, the studio executives were aware that if word of Granger's behavior spread throughout Hollywood, it could damage MGM's reputation as a place where actors were treated professionally. After 2 days of meetings and deliberation, MGM made an unprecedented decision. Stewart Granger would be required to issue a formal apology to Grace Kelly and to undergo sensitivity training about appropriate professional behavior on film sets. Grace Kelly would receive no punishment for the slap, which the studio classified as a justifiable response to workplace harassment. Most significantly, MGM implemented new policies about on-set behavior that protected actors from the kind of systematic undermining that Granger had inflicted on Grace. Stewart Granger was furious with the studio's decision, but he had little choice but to comply if he wanted to continue working at MGM. The formal apology was delivered in front of the same crew that had witnessed the slap. "Miss Kelly," Granger said in a voice that barely concealed his anger, "I apologize for any comments or actions that you found inappropriate. It was not my intention to create a hostile work environment." Grace accepted the apology with dignity, but she made it clear that their professional relationship would be strictly business going forward. "Thank you, Stewart," Grace said calmly. "I look forward to completing this film in a professional and respectful atmosphere." The remainder of filming on Green Fire proceeded without incident, but the dynamic between Grace and Granger had changed completely. Granger no longer attempted any sabotage or undermining behavior. He delivered his lines as written, stuck to his blocking as rehearsed, and maintained minimal off-camera interaction with Grace. Grace, meanwhile, delivered what many considered to be one of her strongest performances. The confidence she had gained from standing up to Granger translated into a more assertive and dynamic on-screen presence. When Green Fire was released in 1954, critics specifically praised Grace Kelly's performance as her most commanding and confident to date. Miss Kelly demonstrates that she can handle adventure roles with the same elegance and strength she brings to romantic dramas, wrote one reviewer. She appears to have grown significantly as an actress. What the reviewers didn't know was that Grace's growth had come not from acting technique, but from learning to defend herself against professional bullying. The incident on the Green Fire set became legendary in Hollywood, though the full details were kept confidential for decades. Grace Kelly's slap became a symbol of what could happen when Hollywood's genteel facade was stripped away and actors were forced to confront the real power dynamics and professional jealousies that existed beneath the surface. But for Grace personally, the incident was transformative. She had discovered that she was capable of protecting herself when threatened. She had learned that maintaining professional politeness was not worth sacrificing her dignity or her career. Most importantly, Grace had proven to herself and to everyone who worked with her that she was not the fragile, privileged socialite that people like Stewart Granger assumed her to be. Grace Kelly was a professional actress who would not be undermined, sabotaged, or bullied by anyone, regardless of their status or experience. Stewart Granger's career continued for several more years, but he never again achieved the level of success he had enjoyed before the Green Fire incident. Word of his behavior spread quietly through Hollywood, and directors became reluctant to cast him opposite strong female leads who might not tolerate his unprofessional tactics. Granger eventually moved back to England, where he spent his later career in smaller films and television productions. Grace Kelly, meanwhile, went on to become one of the most respected and successful actresses of the 1950s, working with directors who valued her professionalism and intelligence. She never again allowed herself to be sabotaged or undermined by a co-star. And she never again had to slap anyone to defend her professional dignity. But Grace Kelly's slap of Stewart Granger remained a powerful reminder that even the most elegant and composed people have limits, and that crossing those limits can have serious consequences. The incident proved that Grace Kelly was not just a beautiful face or a privileged socialite playing at being an actress. She was a professional who took her craft seriously and who would fight to protect her work from anyone who tried to destroy it. Grace Kelly's slap became a Hollywood legend not because it was an example of bad behavior, but because it was an example of someone finally standing up for themselves when they had been pushed too far. And in an industry where young actresses were often expected to accept mistreatment in silence, Grace Kelly's moment of explosive anger became an inspiration for others who refused to be bullied or diminished. The slap heard round Soundstage 12 was more than just a moment of lost temper. It was a declaration that Grace Kelly would not be anyone's victim. If this story shocked you, share it with others who love behind-the-scenes Hollywood drama. Hit that subscribe button and let us know in the comments, what would you have done in Grace Kelly's situation? Don't miss our next video where we reveal other on-set conflicts that changed Hollywood forever. Stories of stars who fought back when they were pushed too far. Remember, sometimes the most important moment in your career is the moment you decide to stop taking abuse and start fighting back. Grace Kelly's slap proves that even princesses know how to throw a punch when necessary.